Welcome to the Chautauqua Science Group presentation, co-sponsored by Mark Wenzler, that directs our climate change initiative. We'll have a talk today, and after the talk, ask any people with questions to come to the mic so that we can record the mic, record the speaker, and the talk will also be recorded if you want to see it again. So let me introduce Mark Wenzler, have him do the honors.
Thanks, Bob, and good morning, everyone. Nice warm morning. So I'm really pleased to continue a great collaboration with the Western New York Land Conservancy. We've had you guys here at Chautauqua many years, and this is the second time this summer. I think that the work that the Land Conservancy does in our area is so important, and it's so well aligned with our climate change initiative. And so it's really my pleasure and honor to have you guys here again at Chautauqua today. So, and today, during our week on sort of 8 billion and counting, how we all sort of live together in an increasingly crowded world, the theme of feeding ourselves, kind of comes up, right? So how do we, as we continue to develop for housing and for commercial properties, how do we preserve the lands that feed us? And I think, we know this is a very agricultural area, but we also know there's a lot of conversion of lands, farmlands into developed lands. And so it's a really important topic as we think about 8 billion and counting. How do we preserve those important lands that keep us all fed and nurtured? And so it's my pleasure to introduce Rachel Chrostowski, who is the Farmland Conservation Director at the Western New York Land Conservancy. Rachel has a degree in geography and environmental studies from SUNY Genesco. However, her education in earth science started at a much earlier age. She credits her geologist mother with her deep love of the natural environment, appreciation for open space, and strong conservation values. Before coming to work for the Land Conservancy in 2015, Rachel was a planner for 9 years in Erie and Livingston counties, where she specialized in land use planning, smart growth, and the protection of agricultural lands. Rachel is excited to work with our region's farmers to protect Western New York's working lands and keep our agricultural heritage alive. Rachel, thank you for being here and welcome.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you all for joining us this morning. So you've got a lot of my professional background through my bio there. But I wanted to talk just very shortly about the reason that I work in conservation. When I was a little kid, I lived in the suburbs of Buffalo. I lived in Cheektowaga and West Seneca, but my grandmother lived in Wyoming County, and my single mom would drive me out to my grandma's house to watch after my brother and I while she was at work. And we got to drive through the open rolling fields of more rural parts of Erie County and into Wyoming County. And we got to play like farm kids do. We played in the barn, we built forts under the trees, and it's the fondest memories of my childhood. But as I got older, the landscape that we drove past as we went out to my grandmother's house became more and more developed. There were more houses than ever. Some of the old barns came down, and by the time I was in high school, we had moved back out to that neck of the woods, and many of my classmates in high school were farmers' kids, and they would come into homeroom, and they'd be wearing their boots, and they'd have mud all over their pants, and it just sort of highlighted for me that this is still a way of life, and it's still a really important part of our community. And so I, as Mark mentioned, I went into planning, and I tried in that role to encourage people to make smart land use decisions, to redevelop the already developed areas, and to protect the open spaces and agricultural lands that I loved so much and saw starting to fade. But after almost 10 years working in planning, I really wanted to have a more tangible impact on these trends. And so I was very fortunate to get a job working at the Western New York Land Conservancy. I've been there for almost well, it's just over 9 years now. And we have done a lot of great work in these last 9 years, but there's so much more good work to do. And today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the agricultural side of our work, why it matters so much. So for those of you that aren't familiar with the Western New York Land Conservancy, we're a nonprofit land trust. We've been around for just over 30 years, and our mission is to permanently protect natural lands and farmlands for the benefit of future generations. Our work is funded by grants, both federal and state, as well as private foundations, and support from the community. We have a lot of community members who support our work through generous donations, as well as donations of their time and volunteering. You can see on this slide some of the beautiful different types of landscapes that we've conserved throughout Western New York. Fields, forests, wetlands, rivers, streams, headwater forests, they all make Western New York a remarkable place to live. Before I move off of this slide, as we behold some of the beauty of this area, I just want to take a moment and acknowledge that the lands that we're protecting are lands of the Haudenosaunee people, the Native American people who came before us. You know, they were removed from this land, and here we all sit on it today. And I just, you know, they were very careful about taking care of the next generation, and that's something that we are striving for in our work as well. So I just wanted to take a moment to acknowledge them. In our approximately 30 years, we've protected about 7,400 acres of land on more than 80 properties across Western New York. But we've been accelerating our land protection these last few years, and right now there's 5,000 additional acres on their way to being protected. So the Western New York Land Conservancy works to protect land in two major ways. The first is that we can raise money to purchase properties and create nature preserves. Many of these properties that we protect are open to the public, and people can go and walk on nature trails and be reminded of all of the reasons why Western New York is a remarkable place and why we need to support that conservation effort. The other half of our work is through conservation easements, and this is the way that we protect some natural land and most of the agricultural land we've protected. About half of those 7,400 acres that have been protected are farmland. I'm going to dive into the specifics of how conservation easements work toward the end of my talk, but because this is a conversation about agriculture and farmland protection in this increasingly crowded world, I want to start with the state of farmland. Our farmland, as Mark mentioned, is under threat. We're losing more farmland than ever before. American Farmland Trust is another nonprofit organization that's done a lot of great research on the threats to farmland. And their most recent study, Farmland Under Threat, notes that across New York, or across the country, we're losing 2,000 acres of farmland a day. It's a really alarming statistic. And just since 2001, New York State has lost over 250,000 acres of farmland. If the current development trends and land conversion continue, we're on track to lose 18 to 24 million acres of farmland across the country by 2040. The other thing that American Farmland Trust's research shows is that 40% of America's farmland is going to change hands over the next 15 years. Because our farmers, I think the average age of farmers in New York is 58 or 60, 62, somewhere around that. It keeps rising, of course. And as these farmers either decide to retire or are unable to continue farming, they're going to leave their land to their heirs, or they're going to sell their land. When that land changes hands, it's at the highest risk of being converted to other uses. Because there are fewer farmers coming into the ag industry, the people who end up owning these lands don't know how to farm, and they aren't connected to the agricultural community that would want to purchase the farmland. And in many cases, developers are more willing to pay more money to protect or to purchase those lands for development purposes. So in addition to losing farmland, we're looking at this trend of farmland changing hands, and even more farmland is going to be even at a higher risk than ever before. The loss of farmland at this alarming rate is worsened by the fact that in the not so distant future, we're going to have more mouths to feed than ever before. Mark mentioned our global population is about 8 billion people. By 2040, projections are that we'll be at 9 billion. By 2080, 10 billion. Not only do we need to be thinking about where are we going to grow food for all of these people, but these people are going to need homes to live in. They're going to need businesses to work at. Those homes and businesses are going to need things like energy generated for them. They're going to need clean water. Everything that supports human population on life is going to need to find room on the surface of this planet. And it's really critical that we protect land on which to grow our food before it's too late. The most obvious benefit of protecting farmland is securing our food system so we can feed ourselves. The US imports about 15% of our food from other countries, and that percentage will increase as we lose farmland and as we lose farmers. All of that food is more vulnerable to things like political instability, environmental risks, the volatility of global markets. And that's a sort of scary thing for us to be facing. And as humankind, that percentage is higher in other places. If we think back to the start of COVID, when we were facing labor shortages, travel restrictions, and changes in demand during lockdown times, we had major disruptions in the agricultural supply chain. It made it harder for more people to access food. By conserving farmland right here where we live, we're strengthening our local food system. We're reducing our reliance on that food that has to come from somewhere else. It's incredibly critical that we think about how much our local food system contributes and how important it is to support the farmers who are making it possible for us to all eat. While we often think of farmland as its contribution for human purposes, there are a lot of environmental and wildlife benefits to farmland protection as well. The soils on which we grow our food support plant growth and nutrient cycling. Our soils also store carbon, which is really beneficial for climate change. And it's especially beneficial if our farmers are participating in regenerative agricultural practices or improving soil health practices by changing the way that they farm. By supporting farmers who do conservation implementation on their farms, we'll be increasing our climate resiliency as well. We also have to think about our farmland as open space. It is, when we get historic amounts of rainfall, that open land allows filtration of water into groundwater. It reduces the potential for there to be flooding and water pollution downstream. It's a lot more affordable for a community to support farmland and open space protection than it is to clean up polluted water or to repair damaged infrastructure from flooding. So thinking of it from the environmental perspective, as well as just how do we feed ourselves, it's really beneficial for the whole community when we protect a farm. And then beyond the human considerations, wildlife. When you go past a farm, you see beautiful woodlots in the back. You see hedgerows with birds swooping in and out. These natural areas provide connectivity for plants and animals, and in the face of climate change, all of that is going to be really important to ensuring that their species are strong, that there's some genetic diversity, and it will create a stronger ecology in Western New York, providing plants and animals this ability to move across the landscape in the face of climate change. So there's a lot more to our farmland than just feeding ourselves. but also it's about safeguarding the backbone of our rural communities and economies. Our region's farms are small businesses. They employ people, they pay taxes, and they also support other aspects of the economy. If you go into a farm community, you're gonna see mechanics, you're gonna see tractor dealers, you're gonna see feed supply stores, you're gonna see food processing facilities. I passed Welch's on the way here. My mom works at Steuben Foods. There are a lot of businesses that are supported when there's a strong agricultural community in a place. And in addition to creating jobs, they also generate tax revenue, and they do all of this without adding additional governmental service needs the way that a residential development might. Our farms also provide opportunities for agritourism. If you have ever had the pleasure of going berry picking, the sun-warmed berries in your hands, bursting in your mouth as you pick through the fields, in the fall when the air is crisp and you go through a corn maze with your kids or grandkids and pick apples, all of that, if you've had the opportunity to do that, thank a farmer. It is the way that you're participating in their business, showing them you care about what they're doing, that you value what they're doing, and it's playing an important role in the local economy. The sort of less tangible part of why we need to protect farmland is about sustaining the tradition of agriculture. I'm going to ask for a little audience participation for just a moment. If you are a farmer, would you raise your hand? Thank you. If you have relatives that are farmers, raise your hands. That's a pretty good number. And raise your hand if your long past ancestral relatives were farmers. It's wild how the number of hands goes up there. How many people here grow their own food? Keep your hand up if you can feed your entire family on what you grow. Good for you. Thank you. It's an incredible set of skills that farmers bring to their work. Not only are they growers, they are mechanics, they are veterinarians, they are accountants and businessmen, marketing professionals. They work tirelessly all year round to make sure that we have food on our tables. Growing up on a farm is an experience I've heard described from the farmers I work with as something that you can't compare to that. And many of the farmers that I talk to today about protecting farmland continue to farm because they want their kids and their grandkids to have those same opportunities to grow up on farms the way that they did. All that those farm families share in terms of tradition, information, experience, knowledge, everything that makes it possible for them to succeed in the face of severe weather, climate change, market conditions that are changing, food price volatility. It's all of the experience that they have and all the knowledge that they hold. When they leave farming, all of that goes with them. And there are fewer and fewer people that take that knowledge into the future. Western New York's history is agricultural. And if we don't do something to support our farmers now, there won't be farmers to be able to continue growing food for our families. I've talked about a lot of the motivations for why we should protect farmland, but I want to sort of underscore that by addressing some of the threats that make it even more imperative than before. This aerial photo that you see on the screen here is a screenshot that I took from Google Maps. It's the town of Lancaster. So it's right here in Western New York. One of the major threats that we see here and all across the country is that much of the land use is sort of short-sighted and it creates fragmented agricultural landscapes. If you were a farmer farming the lands around this development, you would likely have to take your tractor out of the field out onto the road, drive around the block, go back in to be able to continue farming. After a while, that adds up. You are paying for more diesel fuel, that's more wear and tear on your vehicles, all of your equipment, which is more bills for your equipment maintenance, and it's also putting you on the road with new drivers who maybe have never driven alongside a tractor. They don't know what they're doing, and it increases both cost and safety concerns for our farmers. This development also drives up land prices and taxes because all of these people need those services I mentioned before. They want garbage pickup, they want lights on their sidewalks. Also, when these farmers, or when these neighbors move into an agricultural area, they're not accustomed to what living next to a farm is like. There are sounds, smells, dust, all sorts of things that are an integral part of the agricultural activity that's happening there. A lot of people, myself included before I moved out to a rural area, had no idea what that was like. I have a friend who bought a house across the field across the road from a pig farm. And that was a very fragrant awakening for them. Having this many non-farming neighbors adjacent to your farm creates a lot of tension and friction, and it makes farming harder to keep going. You know, you're facing increased volatility from the markets, you're facing increased weather changes, and your neighbors are yelling at you because your manure smells bad. It's snowballing. And then the other thing that you see when the landscape is getting fragmented like this is all of those support businesses, you know, the tractor dealers and feed stores. The fewer farmers there are, the fewer people are patronizing their businesses. Those businesses will go out of business. Then those farmers that remain have to drive farther to get their supplies and equipment, to get everything they need to do business. It makes everything more expensive, everything harder, everything snowballs. So it's really important that we think about protecting farmland because it's this one thread in this entire tapestry of the rural landscape that's been woven over the last, hundreds of years. And as we start pulling the threads out, the fabric is getting pretty threadbare. In addition to residential development, there are other land uses that are now competing with farmland, and because there's been so much land conversion, these uses have always existed, but there's not as much room for them now, and so they're looking for places to go, and farmland is available, and there are a lot of farmers who are thinking, I need to retire. Should I go ahead and let this solar developer put panels on my farmland? It's a good source of income, and the land isn't houses. The soils here in Western New York and across New York State are some of the best for farming, but they are a finite resource, and we all need to remember that once they're gone, they're gone. It's not just renewable energy. I'm not trying to villainize green energy. I have solar panels on my house. I like green energy. But it's about smart siting for all of these other land uses, as hospitals, prisons, schools, businesses, commercial businesses, industrial uses. They've all got to find a spot. Putting these uses on our farmland might seem good now, but down the road, it's going to become a real problem. I mentioned before that our farmers deal with challenges from more severe weather than ever before. We had a farmer just in the town of Eden last week suffer horrible damage from a tornado. I think we've had more tornadoes in the last maybe 5 years in Western New York than I've had in the 35 plus years that I've been around here since before that. The impacts of climate change are difficult to deal with here, but it's far worse other places. There are places in other parts of the country where water scarcity has been a problem for a long time, and it is growing. There are places where wildfires are running rampant, that it's never been a concern this often before. Places along the ocean where you're dealing with increasingly intense hurricanes. There's a lot of places across the country that are becoming less hospitable for people, and people are going to start seeking a refuge, and Western New York is poised to be that refuge. We have so much fresh water, we have ample open space, we have a good growing season. I've talked about the different land uses needing space, and that's going to increase as our population increases, and it's going to increase as people move here from other places. We have a duty to protect land to grow our food now, before it's too late, before all of these changes add even more pressure to our agricultural landscape. Another perhaps more recent challenge that faces our farmers today is consolidation. As you look at this slide, you can see there are about 8 large parcels of land. A generation ago, they were 5 small family farms, and today they are 1 farm. And it might not seem like that big of a deal. Okay, so there's 1 farmer farming the land instead of 5, but what it results in is fewer farm families, fewer jobs, loss of diversity in the type of farm operations, as well as the farm products they're producing, and it's putting more pressure on a smaller group of people. Many of these farms also grow monoculture crops, which contribute less to biodiversity. For example, this farm grows hay, 4 cows. So, it's an important resource to protect, but it's definitely something that our farmers are seeing. As one farm family leaves, maybe a neighbor will say, oh, I've been looking at your land, I'd like to purchase that land. And then before you know it, they've got 600 acres of farmland they've bought up around the neighborhood, and that's great for their operation. Support land is important. But if you think about what it must be like for a new and beginning farmer to come into agriculture, I've touched on the fact that many farmers don't have a succession plan. They don't have the next generation lined up to come in and take over the family farm. But there are farmers who want to come in and who want to get their farm businesses started, that are passionate about feeding people. It's very, very difficult for a new and beginning farmer to get into a farm like this. 600 acres with 5 houses and all of the agricultural structures, they could never begin to afford this farm. So consolidation is going to pose a challenge, a new challenge for new and beginning farmers who just simply don't have the financial resources to be able to come in and acquire a farm this big. So we need to remember that small farms are an important part of our community, and if we don't find ways to support those new and beginning farmers who need smaller bits of land, there's not going to be farmers in the future too. So another big threat is the lack of public awareness about the importance of farmland protection. Our elected officials, government officials, they have a lot of competing demands for their attention and funding, and with fewer farmers in the community, fewer people passionate about it, fewer people educated about it, it's going to be even harder to get more of their time and money. Farmland protection funding, while New York State has a fantastic program, it's limited. We always have more farmers that want to protect their land than we have money to do it. So I want to thank you all for coming here and listening to me wax poetic about the importance of farmland protection, because it's a start. Leave here and tell someone something new that you learned today. Help get the word out. Help keep the conversation going about the importance of supporting our farmland and farmers. So I have gone on a bit about the importance of why we should protect farmland, what are the threats that make it more important than ever. But I'm going to quickly go over a couple of the different methods that exist to protect farmland, and then I'm going to dive deeper into my favorite method of farmland protection. So there are a lot of programs out there that are designed to help and support our farmers. The Agricultural District Program and Right to Farm laws, these identify areas in the community where agriculture is the predominant land use. And it lets people that move in know, you're moving into an agricultural area. And so this is what you can expect. There's gonna be dust, there's gonna be sounds, there's gonna be manure, whatever. And it gives protections to farmers in these areas from private nuisance lawsuits and overly restrictive local laws, and it helps keep the area friendly for farming. There are also community farmland protection plans, either at the town or the county, and these also help to raise awareness about the importance of the agricultural community in those places. There's often public engagement opportunities during that, where farmers and non-farmers can come to the table and say, this is what matters to us. Local zoning ordinances are also a great tool. They're the major land use tool in the toolbox of most communities. There's things like farmland protection zoning, where the zoning actually states that agriculture is the preferred land use, and some of the non-compatible land uses are not allowed in those zones. So that's one helpful way that communities can actually change the landscape a bit. There's also agricultural property tax assessment. So imagine if you're a farmer, you own 200 acres of farmland in a community, you're getting taxed on all of those acres, but your acres have cows on them, or you're growing corn. The cows and corn do not need schools. They do not need sidewalks. They don't need garbage pickup. So tax assessment, agricultural tax assessment is a nice way that the community can lessen the financial impact of owning all that land in a community. There are also agricultural conservation programs through the USDA, the federal programs through the Natural Resource Conservation Service, and the state programs like the Soil and Water Conservation Districts. And all of those offer different ways to help support farmers improve their sustainability, their environmental stewardship of the property, and to become more sustainable into the future. But my favorite method of farmland conservation is conservation easements. Conservation easement is a legal agreement between a landowner and a land trust that limits the use of privately owned land in order to conserve conservation values. The easement designates different use areas on the property, and it prohibits certain uses in certain areas to help protect the resources that are there. This land, unlike a nature preserve where we're buying it, it stays privately owned. So the farmers can continue to own and operate their farm businesses on the land. They can sell the property, they can will it to their heirs, but the land is protected forever. And the Land Conservancy goes to each property that we protect every year to ensure that the terms of conservation easements are being upheld. I mentioned the easement establishes use areas. So on an average farm, you have a farmstead area. This is where you're going to have your home, your barns, your silos, stuff like that. This is the area on the farm where there are the fewest restrictions. The only main restriction is you have to keep it with the rest of the farm. It's part of making agriculture viable in that spot. The area outside of the farmstead is called the farm area, and that's going to be the area where you have your fields, your pastures, your woodlots. You're allowed to have agricultural structures there, but it's going to be limited to a certain percentage. And then the resource protection area, some farms have remarkable natural areas on them as well. And a resource protection area will prohibit any sort of development from going in that spot, just to provide additional environmental protections. So this is sort of how the easement regulates what's going on the land, how it does the protection. So how do we make use of conservation easements at the Land Conservancy? There's a New York State program that we use most often. There are others, but New York State's is the one that seems to work best right now for us. We start with a conversation with a willing landowner. A farmer contacts us or calls us, or maybe someone at Soil and Water says, you should talk to Rachel about protecting your farm. And when I sit down and meet with them, we talk about how the program works, make sure that it's a good fit for them, and make sure that the program is going to help them be successful in the future. We do all of the work. Our farmers don't have time to sit and fill out grant applications, and we have the expertise. So we're able to do all of that work, and once we submit an application and a farmer receives a grant award, they can use that money for whatever they need. They can retire, they can pay off debt, they can reinvest in the farm or buy more land. There's no limitation to how that money can be used. And they're walking away knowing that their land is protected forever, not only the land, but their family's legacy. I mentioned the New York State grant works the best, and the reason why is that they cover the most costs. They pay for all of the project costs. Like buying or selling a house, this is a real estate transaction. So there's due diligence work that we have to do. The grant covers the Land Conservancy's staff time and legal fees to do all of this. It pays for all of that due diligence transaction work, like appraisals and surveys and title work. And it also pays for our stewardship fund, which gives us funding to ensure that the easement terms are being upheld in the future. But most importantly, it pays the farmers for 87.5%, crazy percentage, of the value of their development rights. So they're getting, they're limiting their use of the land in the future, but there's monetary value to that, and the government will pay you 87.5% of that. So it's a nice chunk of money for most farmers to help support their farm financially while also conserving the land. I just have a couple more slides for you, and then I'll wrap up. But I want to talk about a couple of the success stories that we've had in protecting our farmland. And the two men you see standing proudly in front of their tractor there are John and Ken Kappas. They are dairy farmers from the town of Eden. They are the third generation of Kappases to farm on their century-old 300-acre farm. Unfortunately, they didn't have anyone in their family who was able to take it over. At the time, Ken was in his, I think he was in his 50s, yep, and, John was in his 50s, Ken was in his 60s, and was facing some health challenges. And they were facing this really hard truth that no one can farm forever. They weren't sure what they were going to do, but when we got to work with them, we were able to put conservation easements on their land through this New York State program. Having the money from the grant lessened the burden on them to keep going, and shortly after the easement was put on the property, Ken did pass away. John was secure on the farm because of the easement, and he was able to sort of step back as the main farmer of the property. He leased it to another new operator. So he's helping a new farm family get their start while he's able to step away and the land is protected forever. A really, sort of sad but heartwarming story too. It could have been a very bleak situation if the easement hadn't been there. I want to share one more story with you. This is a story of the WBB farm, which is in the town of Alden in Erie County. When we met Brenda and Warren Bippert, they were the fourth generation of farmers from their families. They were raising beef and dairy replacement, as well as some veggie crops and other field crops. And they had decided as a couple to continue their family tradition of farming because they loved it so much growing up. They wanted to give that opportunity to their kids. As the years went on, of course, Brenda and Warren were getting older. Brenda had an off-farm job. She was still working and was hoping to retire. Warren had had some health scares. They wanted to make sure that there was something in place to help protect their family's farm and their family history and heritage. So they decided to protect their 180 acres with a conservation easement. And when the project was finished, they paid off their mortgage. Brenda was able to retire and spend more time with Warren and her kids and grandkids. And when Warren passed away earlier this year, Brenda was secure on her farm. Her family was able to step in and help her keep going, and they're going strong today because of the conservation easement. Not to mention all of their hard work. I don't mean to claim all the credit for that. They're doing amazing work there. But Brenda was so pleased with the program that she shared her experience with one of her nephews, who I recently met with to talk about protecting their farm. So in addition to protecting the agricultural history, protecting their family's heritage, they're also starting a new tradition of conservation. So those are just two stories of farmers that we've been able to help with this program. There are land trusts all across New York State and the country who are doing this fantastic work to help farm families, but there's a lot more that we can do. And when we think about the impact of this work, it's not just helping a farmer, helping a farm family. We're all benefiting from this. A strong rural economy that, gives us clean, fresh, local food to purchase, to put on our families' tables. The beautiful rolling hills, fields, landscapes that we all enjoy. They also provide those environmental benefits like the clean water and wildlife habitat. And as we're looking at this increasingly crowded world, and we are, seeing all of these changes, farmland protection is just one of the answers. As you leave here today, think about what you can do to help in this effort. First of all, support your local farmers. If you go to a farm market, if you go to their farm stand, if you join a CSA, the Community Supported Agriculture, these are all ways to directly financially support the farmers who are working in your communities. And it sends the message, I see you, I value you. Please keep going. The next suggestion I have is sort of a pet peeve of mine. Watching farmland get converted to other uses just really grinds my gears. And, I saw a statistic not too long ago, I think it might have been Erie County. The housing stock, there were more houses than there were households. There are enough houses out there. You don't need to build a new one on a farm field. So if you have the opportunity to choose an existing house, please do. And then lastly, there are organizations like the Western New York Land Conservancy, like American Farmland Trust, who are working in your communities and across the country. Support those conservation initiatives. They make doing this conservation work possible. We appreciate both philanthropic contributions, but also volunteering, your time, your support, and just spreading the word. All of it is helpful and contributes. Okay. I'm done. So if you have questions and you haven't passed out from the heat, please feel free to come up. I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Thank you. So thank you, Rachel. While we're still all here, I want to announce our speaker next week is Professor Kevin Teichman. He'll talk about what you can do to help prevent climate change in this world. So come back again next week to see us. Please, when you come up, ask your question, please. We don't want a speech because we've already had one, but we're happy to have you ask questions, and Rachel will answer them. Thank you.
Two concerns I'd like you to address. You mentioned we import 15% of our food. What percentage of our food that we grow do we export? I mean, I can see that 15%, we got to bring in olives from somewhere and whatnot. Yeah. The other question I have, you talk about housing stock being in excess of houses. Do you think that has something to do with the policies of the New York legislature and their taxing and so forth, that they're forcing people out of New York?
Those are two very good questions. I'm afraid I don't know the answer to the question about how much land or how much agricultural product is sent away. I suppose that I would think that, that external demand for our products is supporting our local farmers, but it's a good point that, if our farmers have local markets, they can grow products to serve us right here that might be better. As to your question about New York State laws and policies, I have absolutely heard from farmers that they take umbrage with a lot of the regulations and taxing and things that make business harder for them. So yeah, I'm sure it plays a factor. I don't have the answer about how we address that, but we're listening. And we do advocate for farmland protection funding. Perhaps there are opportunities for communicating those messages too. Thank you.
I just looked on the internet. It says 20% of U.S. farmer produce is exported.
Yes, thank you for looking that up while I was blathering. The answer was 20% of American agricultural products are exported. So we're sending out more than we're bringing in, but it is that globalized market instead of that all the food staying here.
The question I have is to ask, what kind of pressure does your farmland have locally for massive computer centers? In Loudoun County, a suburb of Washington, D.C., they're installing these huge computer centers for AI calculations, etc. I was just wondering, is there pressure here in this area for building some of these huge centers on land, on agricultural land? That's my question.
Yeah, I can say I haven't heard of. Marisa has heard. Do you want to come up here? I'm going to briefly introduce the Land Conservancy's Executive Director, Marisa Rigi, who can answer your question better than I can.
Sure. So we have, especially with Niagara Falls, we have not very expensive energy here. So we have a fair number of Bitcoin operations going in up in Niagara County and New Orleans County, and those are going in usually on farmland. So it is a pretty big pressure, especially with the energy we get from Niagara Falls.
Thanks, Marisa.
My question pertains to the influence of foreign countries coming in and either long-term leasing or purchasing land. I haven't heard about that in my area in North Carolina or potentially New York, but in the Southwest they seem to be doing this and sucking the water table out. Have you seen any of that in New York, and are there any legislative protections to stop these countries from doing this?
I don't think there are legislative protections, or if there are, I'm not aware of them. But I'm certainly not an expert in that area, so you'd have to look, do a little research to be sure. I haven't seen a great deal of other nations buying up our farmland, with the exception of up in Niagara County. One of the farmers I work with, one of their neighbors, is I'll loosely use the words absentee landlord from Canada. So I think just our proximity to Canada, you're going to have some Canadian land ownership happening. But I don't know whether it's really going to impact agriculture here. I would imagine in time that dynamic will change. It'll probably grow.
Well, and is that a threat to our food supply?
In New York State, the landowners have a great deal of rights on what they're able to do on their own properties. I would imagine it probably does have the impact or the potential to impact our food system. It's probably something that our government leaders are going to have to pay attention to, and that the legislative regulations might address that in a better way to help secure our local foods. Again, I'm not really an expert in that area, but it's a very good question.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for helping to educate us. I'm always struck how complicated and interacting these issues are. When we started coming here, there was a controversy in New York and Pennsylvania over fracking. And my understanding is that in Pennsylvania, a number of farm owners succumbed to the temptations of being paid to let fracking take place on their land.
Yeah.
And they made a little bit in the short term, and it didn't pay out the way they thought. maybe you all can help educate farmers on sometimes the temptations of short-term money are just that, short-term and short money. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a very good point. When I do outreach for our farmland protection program and try to find farmers who want to participate, many of them already see how short-sighted a lot of that alternative access to money might be, and that's why they're there talking to me. But it's definitely something that more landowners need an opportunity to learn about. Go ahead.
I'm going to ask you about something that, as a mom, I've probably had the most exposure with my children to farms, which is the agritourism.
Yes.
I live in South Florida, and that's really where I know these people are making a lot of money, strawberry picking, haunted hay rides, and things like that in Halloween time. What's the position with the easement regulations on that? And do you think, what's your position on farmers taking on that for part of their land use overall as a long term?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a good question. And as a mom, I'm with you there. I've given a lot of thought to this. The regulations in the conservation easements, that farmstead area, you can do stuff like that there. And I think it's an important part of a farm business being diversified in terms of their sources of income, but I think it's also a really important part of outreach and building support for what they do. Yeah, I think the agritourism components of the land protection that we're doing, one of the farmers that I'm working with now is an orchard operation. They do a lot of U-pick, so it's compatible. I think it's a really helpful aspect of connecting people to agriculture in a more conventional way. Does that answer your question?
Yes, yes. And also I think it can bring jobs to regions in certain times of the year as well, right?
Absolutely,
Yeah.
yeah. Harvesting some of that, or running a U-pick operation, it definitely requires additional staff on the part of the farm. So yes, extra job opportunities provided by that as well. Thank you.
Rachel, thanks for raising our consciousness on farmland preservation, but it seems to me that not only are there threats to the farms, there are threats from the farms. And specifically, I'm referring to phosphorus runoff from farm fields for fertilizer and manure. 1 pound of phosphorus entering your lake results in 500 pounds of algae. When we arrived on Saturday, there was no swimming here on the lake, I think because of an algae bloom.
Yeah.
So what, if any, programs or legislation is the Land Conservancy supporting to stem the tide of phosphorus runoff from farms?
That's a great question, and definitely something I think about as I talk about the environmental benefits of farmland. As a nonprofit, we're not doing lobbying on legislative stuff like that. However, we have worked with some farmers on adding additional programs, helping them work with like the Soil and Water Conservation District or Natural Resources Conservation Service on implementing stream buffers. They are, the wider the buffer and the healthier the buffer, the more water filtration is happening before the water leaves the site. We've seen a historic trend of people narrowing their buffers to try and plant as much as they can. And there are programs, even at the state through the farmland protection element of the program, that support the planting of additional buffers. So there's some of that on the ground activity that can help reduce the runoff. And then in terms of actually reducing the amount used, I think the more we see a transition from that large-scale monoculture kind of farming and go back to a more small farm, local produce, directly feeding people kind of agriculture, there's a lot more demand for things to be organic and to be more sustainable and environmentally friendly. So I think there's an opportunity there for us to change that dynamic.
Thank you.
Thank you. Hi. Hi there.
So in New Jersey, we're in the process of passing soil protection standards to regulate the amount or the percentage of preserved farmland that can be used for development purposes. This has been very controversial amongst the farming community and very difficult to pass. But we're also hearing from farmers that in order to move forward to progress their agricultural purposes, they need warehouses to store their food. They need warehouses as slaughterhouses if they're raising livestock. And in New Jersey, it's such a small state, it's really hard to find the land for those purposes. So how do you reconcile the need for open spaces and conservation and protection and the need for development for these agricultural purposes?
It's such a big and important question. With my background in planning, I'd like to say redevelop some of the vacant sites. I know that costs more money. I also know that there are grant opportunities available to help redevelop brownfields. I don't know the answer to that question, but it's certainly part of the equation, as we're looking at farmland being converted, but also supporting farming and making sure that it's viable into the future. It's very challenging. I think there's going to have to be some innovation and changes in land use regulations, but they're just simply not making any more land. It's not more prime farmland, for sure. Thank you. I'm sorry, I don't have a great answer for you, but it's a great question.
Hi, thank you for coming. I have a question about the Amish. I'm curious to know if that presents challenges. I was going to ask how much you work with the Amish community and if that presents challenges of its own.
It's something I've been thinking about a lot more lately. I haven't had the opportunity to work with anyone in the Amish community. It's possible that other land trusts have. I can see that there would be some cultural challenges in terms of going through the entire process of protecting land and staying in touch with the community. I'm not certain that culturally they would be interested in working with us other than to perhaps acquire already protected land. It's an interesting thought, and I know that some of the agricultural or Amish communities here are going through some changes, and so it's been on my mind more than ever, but I don't have any experience working with them just yet.
Hi, thank you. I have a question about the longish term implications of the easement. You emphasize that the farmland is protected forever.
Yeah.
And forever is a long time.
Yes, it is.
So I guess I'm wondering, if I'm right that there's a trend for fewer of the children of farmers to want to stay in farming, and which suggests that there's fewer people overall going into the future that want to farm. What happens 3 or 4 generations from now if there aren't people who want to take over that land for farming purposes? What are the options? Can people live in the farmhouses and then sublet the land for farming? Or what happens as fewer and fewer people want to farm?
Yeah, well, you've captured that pretty well in your question, actually. The protected farmland that we have, sorry, I just completely lost my train of thought. I was like, oh no, the train left the station. The easements that we have don't prescribe agriculture, so they're not forcing someone to farm. So if they're not able to farm or there is no one to farm, the easements are not requiring people to farm it. It's simply setting the land aside to be available for agriculture. If I wanted to go and buy a property that's protected with an agricultural conservation easement, I could live in the farmhouse, I could lease the farmland to an adjacent farmer, or even a new and beginning farmer, but the easement will stay with the land as long as land use laws and land ownership exist. But yeah, very good question.
Okay. Last question.
Hi.
Hi there.
The Farm Bill, the U.S. Farm Bill 2023, which has yet to be passed, is still in play. And although you had mentioned you don't lobby, you can educate and advocate. And I'm just wondering if your organization is engaged in that work, either with the larger, like American Farmland Trust, and that just a call to action for all of us here, if you can't say it, might be that we contact our senators and members of Congress now and let them know what you're concerned about. There's the $22 billion that was in the IRA, which is conservation money, and you mentioned like EQIP, which is one of those bills that desperately needs money. There's a threat that that money, that $22 billion, may roll into the Farm Bill and then not go to conservation, and that's a real concern. So that's kind of one question. And just about the right to farm, it's preemptive, and there's sort of risk to local people, though, too. I think it's one thing to come in. If you could clarify that a little bit, because like there was this great film documentary, The Smell of Money, that you might know about. And there are health consequences, and it's usually low-income Black communities that are more at risk to the health, like the spraying of manure into the community. So they have rights too.
Yes, of course. So to your first point about advocacy, we work with land trusts and the American Farmland Trust on an Alliance for New York's Farms, and we help to communicate to the the New York State Department of Agriculture about the different concerns we have and to request funding to continue to support our work. But yes, beyond that, in terms of directly trying to influence what's in the Farm Bill, it's not something we're currently doing. So thank you for your comments on contacting your local representatives. The impacts of a lot of the, when I was learning about the right to farm laws, what I saw was that if the farmer is using like standard accepted agricultural practices, then neighbors don't have any footing in a nuisance lawsuit. So there is sort of that, like, if a farmer is doing something that is technically a standard practice and it's negatively impacting the neighbors and you're in an agricultural community, I would suppose that there is the potential there for that to be a negative if you're a non-farmer. I'm sure that there are farmers out there who are not as respectful of their neighbors as others, but the majority of the farmers that I have worked with have wonderful relationships with their neighbors and work hard to be good neighbors. I'm not saying it's not a concern, it certainly is, and it has affected a lot of people, and I didn't touch at all on disenfranchised people having access to farmland or being impacted by any of this, but it's certainly something that we think about and talk about a lot more often than we used to, and we're looking for ways to improve BIPOC access to farmland as well as to improve environmental justice concerns where it pertains to agriculture. I hope that's an okay answer.
You have to speak to the mic. Please make it quick because we're running short.
As one of the few farmers in the room, thank you.
As a comment that concerns me, this week we're looking at, and I struggle, I can't put this in question form, so it's just a statement. Sure. We are looking at, we saw demographics of world population at the turn of the century, and these numbers are from memory, but I'm thinking that an acre of land could feed 5 people. Now, 20 years ago, they were up to the 13, 14, where about 16 people can eat off an acre of land if you do maximum sustainable farming. That number, because of people like you and college institutions, universities, farmers have become more efficient, but that number is there's a finite number to how much food I can produce off an acre of land. Yeah. And the population, that curve is far less steep than the population curve that we see in the meetings tomorrow. Folks, we're going to run out of food. Yeah. We farmers, as a small, I'm the small farmer that grows produce for a farm stand for the community, but we cannot sustain this.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And that's why it's important also for our farmers to be implementing soil health practices and being mindful of protecting and supporting that resource, that they are stewards of, that they depend on and that we all depend on. Thank you for mentioning it.
Let's thank Rachel again, please. And a word from our sponsor.
When is enough enough? That's one of the, I wish there was an 11th commandment that said enough is enough. But I'm glad we have enough of you here today, and I want to thank you for coming. And I used to be in the Foreign Service, and I realized farming is an international issue. Eating is an international issue. I spent a morning breakfast in a diner in Idaho, where the Idaho farmers hated the government, just railed against the government, but they had a board up showing the price of their products in Karachi. They were making a big share of their money because we taxpayers had AID overseas and ag people selling American food products. But it seems to me that one answer, we need to help other countries farm better. We need to have other people's farmland raise food rather than poppies. Go back to raising food other than palm oil. And to do that, we need to encourage programs, spend some of our precious money to help other people. And I need you to put some money in the hats in the back so we can keep doing these talks. Thank you.
Thank you so much for coming today and for your great questions and for listening. And many thanks to the Chautauqua Institution, Mark, Bob, and Bob for having me. Thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of your day.